Welcome to Motivated to Lead podcast, helping you become a better leader. I'm your host, Mark Cunningham. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for our podcast this week. My name is Mark Klingsheim with SEMA Partners. Each week, we interview leaders and they share lessons learned from their careers. Our goal is to help you become a better leader. This week, we're going to revisit a conversation that we had some time ago with Dr. Julia Lee Cunningham, and she's an associate professor of management organizations at the Stephen Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. And she serves on the faculty and is co-director for the Center for Positive Organizations. And she has some great insights that she's learned in her career and working with organizations. Looking forward to today's conversation with Julia. Can you give us just a little bit of your story, a little bit of your background, and kind of how you got to the point where you are today as far as...
Sure. So I'm an associate professor in management and organizations group at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. But as I was telling you before, I was born and raised in South Korea, and I studied international relations and politics at Korea University, thinking that one day maybe I'll become a diplomat. So that was what I was thinking, I guess, when I was in my early 20s. My career took a very different turn once I came to the U.S. in my early 20s. I received 3 degrees from Harvard University, including my PhD in public policy. I specialized in this new burgeoning field of judgment and decision-making, so psychology of decision-making. And I also studied behavior economics. And I have been on the Michigan faculty since 2017. So that's who I am. I'd be happy to talk more about research and teaching, that kind of thing, if you want to know more.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking back, you said you came to the U.S. in your early 20s, and we talked a little bit about that before we got started today. But if you were able to go back, knowing what you know now, and talk to a 22-year-old Julia, what advice would you give her?
That's a really good question. And it got me really thinking a lot about what I was like back then. And as I mentioned, I was a political scientist by training, and I thought I would work for the Korean government because I've always been interested in solving like big problems like international conflict. And, growing up in Korea, I have always been concerned about the threats from North Korea, like national security wise, and also in terms of the refugee issues. But in my early 20s, I found myself increasingly dismayed by lots and lots of unsolicited advice I was getting from my peers, from my professors, and the most, common one was that you should not be studying international security because you don't have military background. So just to give you a little bit more context, because of the threat from North Korea, South Korean men all have to serve in the military, like it's a mandatory service. And therefore, what was suggested to me was that there is no real space for women in terms of being an expert on international security issues. And back then, I somewhat naively believed that getting more degrees and credentials from the U.S. academic institutions would somehow compensate for my lack of military experience. And that is how and why I applied for a master's degree at Harvard Kennedy School, which is a school of public policy. Unexpectedly, though, I ended up falling in love with this new field of psychology of decision-making during my time at the Kennedy School. And it was the kind of area that was perfectly designed to address exactly what I've been fascinated with. So I ended up really taking a chance at that and leaving the field that I thought I was married to, right? Which was in national security. But even later in my 20s, I have also heard similar paternalistic advice from many, many people. Like, I'm just telling you because you probably won't be happy. You just don't seem to be the type who would do well in the business school. It's a tough world out there. And clearly kind of advice I was getting didn't really prevent me from actually pursuing a career in the business school. But I would tell her, myself in my 20s, that you are actually stronger than what society wants you to believe. So that would be the advice. Yeah.
So you've done a lot of research around leadership. And we talked when we first met a little bit about that, and definitely would love to get your thoughts. You mentioned that a lot of people are afraid to step into leadership roles, that they have misconceptions around leadership. Talk a little bit about that. I'd love to get your insights and what you've learned around that topic.
Sure. So for research, I study the psychology of beliefs and narratives. So what I've been really passionate about in terms of research for all along has been really trying to understand how these stories that people tell themselves shape our objective reality and end up becoming self-fulfilling. So I try to use this like scientific knowledge that we generate in the laboratory and with students to help others develop a healthier narrative about themselves in life and also in their careers. And so when I first started at Michigan, I was a postdoctoral fellow, and I met with Sue Ashford, who you already interviewed. I think your listeners are probably familiar with her as well. And she's an awesome leadership expert and also a wonderful, wonderful human being. And I had this privilege of working with her early in my career. And I also got to work with Laura Sande, who's currently a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. And she just has a brilliant mind and such a beloved professor today. And I remember us sitting down at the table in Sue's office together and thinking a lot about what is it about this particular identity of being a leader? Why is this particular identity so uncomfortable for a lot of people? And we asked this question because we were sitting on this data set that we had collected before from our classes. So identity seems to be such a fundamental, central thing that everyone is kind of working off of every day. And it's so leader identity is about what makes people see themselves as leaders or not. And what we already know about identity in general is that it tends to be influencing how we think and behave, right? So, for example, we know that telling people don't be a cheater is more effective than just telling them don't cheat. And telling people to be a voter is also more effective in actually getting them to vote than telling people to just vote, please vote. And these are because people have this need to be consistent with your identity or avoid an identity that you don't want to see yourself in. So in the case of cheater, you don't want to associate with it. And then in terms of like voter, you do want to have this identity of voter and being a good citizen and whatnot. So we know that identity is really critical because it has shown to actually influence behaviors. And in the case of leader identity, we have found that it's really an important predictor for people's motivation to lead in a given situation, and also people's willingness to seek out leadership opportunities out there. And we learned that from the data set that I was just mentioning, when we ask, do you think of yourself as a leader, we get very different types of responses. Despite the fact that we are in the school system where, we are all telling students that you're the leader tomorrow and today, and you're leaders and the best. And there's this very compelling narrative about how we're educating the next generation of leaders. So I thought this would be a pretty common identity if we asked people or students around us, do you see yourself as a leader? But what we found was that actually it's not as common as we think. And so maybe small subset of our students would say, absolutely, yes, I am a leader under all circumstances. But most people will say it kind of depends on the situation that I'm in. And it also brings up an interesting I think of this as an interesting phenomena, especially because we're kind of moving away from this traditional understanding of leadership, which was defined by where you are in this big organizational chart, right? Like the one who's at the top, and those are usually the ones who are called leaders. But that kind of traditional understanding of leadership is no longer very relevant here, because people often are getting pulled into working in teams that are flat and there's no designated leader often, and you're being pulled in because you are supposed to solve very important, challenging problems, and everyone has a very specific expertise, and you're supposed to manage that team dynamics. So in this kind of a changing world of work that doesn't necessarily have a designated leader, whether you see yourself as a leader or not might have much more important implications for whether you actually step up and behave as leaders or not. So instead of saying that you are a leader every day, all the time, we kind of accepted this idea that leadership may be a contextually dependent identity, that people either accept it and endorse it in the moment, or not. So that's how we all got started with this idea of what is it that makes it so difficult for people to endorse this identity and see themselves as a leader?
So what do you think some of the biggest fears are that you've identified of moving into a leadership position? There are a lot of people you talk to and say, well, I like being a follower. I don't think I'm a leader. I wasn't born to be a leader. What are the fears that keep people from moving into that leadership?
Sure. So we actually set out to do a qualitative investigation of this topic, because we didn't really have a very clear idea of where this fear might be coming from. And luckily, we had a qualitative researcher on our team, which is Dr. Laura Sunday. And we ended up identifying 3 types of reputational fears that people seem to have in their mind. So let's say you're going into this kind of a team for the first time, and we typically have this program called Multidisciplinary Action Project for our MBA students and our BBA students. And it's a consulting project, and so the students are put into teams and they go into companies like Amazon, for instance, and go in and solve a very challenging problem there. And there's no designated leader per se. And as you meet with the team for the first time, you're in your mind, you will consider, okay, in this team, am I a leader or am I not a leader? Should I step up and try to lead or not? And so the first one that we found from looking at the data that we collected that is more qualitative was that people tend to fear about being seen as domineering. And because unfortunately, people still have this association in their mind that being a leader is associated with being bossy or pushy or domineering. And that is not the kind of identity that people are okay with. They don't like to be associated with that bossy person. And they don't want to be coming across as somebody who's pushy. So that was the first fear. And the second one is that what we call the fear of seeming different. Because people don't really want to draw too much attention to themselves sometimes. And also sometimes people may think that if I say I'm a leader in this group, maybe I'm insinuating that you are the followers. And so you're creating this like status difference and you're different from everybody else. You're better than they are. And so that kind of fear, or not the fear, but the fact that people don't want to insinuate that we're different, it plays back into your mind that, oh, maybe if I step up and lead, that means I'm creating more distance from you. So that's the second fear. The third one we identified was a fear of seeming unqualified. This is something that goes hand in hand with imposter syndrome, which is what a lot of people are experiencing today. And maybe people think that I'm not the best person to do this particular job because I don't know everything and I don't have a specific expertise to do this, and maybe people won't really take me seriously, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the last one that people may fear, that I would be seen as unqualified in their eyes. So those are the three fundamental fears that people have, because leadership is fundamentally a social and relational construct. And so people tend to think a lot about how other people see me if I were to step up and lead.
So how do you think a company, an organization can develop a leadership culture where people that maybe don't feel like they're leaders get opportunities as far as to lead, whether it's a small team and we've got a lot of listeners that are first-time leaders, first-time CEOs. How do you develop that kind of culture?
Yeah, that's a really $1 million question, isn't it? So we actually went deeper into this question of, okay, now that we have identified that people have these three fundamental challenges and risks that they foresee, they anticipate when they think about leading. So how do we really address the fears that people have? Because these fears, we found that actually have real consequences. So the more people identify with these fears, the less likely they are seen as leaders in the teams. And also the bosses also rate you as less likely to be a leader. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about what is it that the companies can do or your bosses can do to prevent people from holding on to these fears and forego all these leadership opportunities that they might be given. And so we ran some studies to figure out, are there specific beliefs that we can create more in an organization? And one of them was that this idea that leadership is something that you're born with versus leadership is something that can be developed. It sounds pretty obvious to you or to me that leadership is something that can be developed, because I am in the field of education, and developing people into leaders is something that I am tasked to do. So it's easy to believe that, but when we ask people about this, we also found out that a lot of people hold this belief that leaders are born, and many of the examples actually come from parents. And when they think about their kids, like some kids tend to be naturally more leader-like, and some kids tend to be not so leader-like. And so this like idea that leadership is biologically determined is actually not as helpful when it comes to persuading people that when you have these fears about how your reputations may be harmed if you lead, those fears might loom larger for people who have this fixed view of leadership, because once they try and then if they fail, they may take that as a signal that my fears were right. They were justified, and therefore I'm not going to be the leader anymore, and I will just like say I'm just not the leader type and just move away from the opportunities. And so what we found was that it was really important to tell people that leadership is something that can be developed over time. And so anything that companies can do to bolster that idea would help people develop healthier relationship with this identity of being a leader. So the other thing that I would mention is that managers can also help employees feel more comfortable seeing themselves as leaders, right? You can present leadership opportunities as a little bit less risky and lower stake than this is something that's like lofty, this like a mythical understanding of leadership. Instead of that, you can think of it as, being a contribution. You're contributing to a collective good, and therefore, this is something that we value as an organization, as opposed to talking about leadership as something that only few people can do, right? Only a certain individuals who look like this, who have like assertive personalities can do. So I can imagine there are many things that companies and managers can do together to create an environment where leadership failures are also openly shared, and so not seen as, okay, I failed and therefore I can never do it again, but it is something that everyone have to experience at some point, and then you live and learn. And so having this like learning and developmental mindset can be fostered in organizations.
So, are there books that you recommend to leaders that you recommend to your students or other leaders that you think would be helpful for them as they're growing in their leadership ability?
So I tend to recommend the kind of books that are written by academics rather than the books that are written by very successful business leaders, and
Sure.
And so. Of course, I can recommend the books that are written by my own colleagues in my field. And Sue's book is one that I recommend a lot to people who want to kind of try out this like leadership as a journey.
Right.
And I am also currently reading this book by Laura Huang at Harvard Business School, which is called Edge. It's the subtitle is Turning Adversity into Advantage. And I would like to highly recommend it because it's filled with lots of practical advice based on science. And it's also designed to help anyone at all levels of leadership, as opposed to very small subset of C-suite individuals who may need extra help. So those are the two books I would recommend.
Great. So outside of work, what do you do to recharge?
I do many things, actually. I am currently so this is like my weekly ritual, which is to take a bath and to de-stress like the Japanese snow monkeys do, just to reduce my cortisol level. I also like to go see bird watching. So I like to go see birds, even though I can never quite get up so early to see many of them. I always feel like I miss them by the time I get there. And unrelatedly, I have recently become fascinated with archery. I really like being able to focus on the target and nothing else, and it's very zen. So I really love doing that.
Yeah, very cool. What parting advice would you give a new or up and coming leader?
I think it's really important to demystify leadership. And the earlier you do that, the better. So I would like to encourage all the listeners to think of themselves as a valued contributor, embrace life's uncertainty, and craft and control your narratives.
Well, Julia, this has been a lot of fun. I definitely appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to give your thoughts today. I know this is going to be helpful for our listeners, and wish you continued success in all that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. I haven't really talked about this research in a while, although we started working on this project in 2015. And so really pleasure to be able to share this research with your listeners. And thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you for listening to the Motivated to Lead podcast. Please subscribe on iTunes. You can also see a video version of this interview at motivatedtolead.com. This podcast is brought to you by SEMA Partners, helping you find your next great leader.